So I operate mostly in the literary space. I'm very passionate about African literature. Um, that comes from an experience where I picked up a book of African literature. It would have been like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And for the first time in my life, growing up in Africa, for the first time in my life, I actually saw a reality that reflected my own. I'm involved mostly in making people more aware of the different kinds of books that are out there. When I say African literature, I mean literature from all over the world that's written by people of African descent. So we know that there are people who are stolen from Africa hundreds of years ago who are still producing content in the Caribbean, in the Americas. We know that there are Africans living everywhere in the world now as well, and they're also producing content, but there are also people on the African continent itself who are producing content. And even though I think literature, when we think of literature, often people think, oh, it's just books. I'm like, yes, I started off with just books, but I'm also a spoken word artist and a storyteller. And a lot of our books were written as a way of preserving our oral traditions. So, you know, you can't limit it to just the written word. You also have to include the spoken word. I can locate my own strategies that I'm using. So within the Pan-African Poets Cafe, which is this African literature space, I basically provide a platform for Black people. And when I say Black, we're living in the Australian context, so it's Indigenous, Pacific Islander, and African. Like what I put on regular gigs at events, and I just make sure that I have a lot of different people, and I curate a performance where I have very clearly distinct voices speaking on the same thing. I never had to consider diversity until I entered the space. So when I say the space, I mean the space called Australia.
Yeah.
So we have to say quite clearly that we're talking about diversity in the historical and political context of the White Australia policy, right? Which continues to this day in more subtle ways, you know, than the explicit form that we experienced till the mid-1970s. So when we talk about that, we're understanding that we're coming into space where it's the visibility, being a visible presence, having a visible presence, which means, and so the invisible, so the, what would they say, the cultural referent, the silent referent is always Europe, is always white, right? So the silent referent is always the Anglo culture in this space. Diversity really means being a non-Anglo person who has beliefs and behaviors that are quite either exoticized or demonized. Well, it seems that there's a huge interest in diversity at the moment. Well done, firstly. I'm glad that it's finally made. Like there are a lot of people who've agitated for many years to diversify.
Yeah.
So now it's a question of our systems, and it's a question of the terms of reference of what diversity actually is and what it looks like. And I think the people to answer that are actually the people that are referred to as diverse, right? So the people who've been historically excluded from these institutions, not the people who've always been inside of them. Because what this entails is really, it's going to be a very uncomfortable, very challenging time for those who've always been in a position of power. Even though they don't want to acknowledge it, I think it's time for people to acknowledge that they are in a position of power because their culture, their skin color passes, right? As not to be questioned, as the standard. And I think for them to have an understanding of what that actually is and how that came about historically is important and significant. So one strategy that we've talked about, obviously, which is like, it's okay, it's tokenistic, it's window dressing, is just to have one position open, it's an internship, it's a short-term position, it's training, it's that kind of thinking, which is very antiquated. And then the other thing, I think you would actually have to look at people on the ground who are actually forming their own organizations or companies because they've had difficulty gaining access into the mainstream institution. Yeah. So if you look, those are conversations that you can have with those particular people. So like Candy Bowers, for instance, and her sister Kim Busty Beats Bowers have Black Honey Company, and the work that they're doing, and they're leaders in this area of diversity. So it's great to have a discussion with them and to look at the work that they're doing and how they're creating diversity. Then you get people like Tanya Kanyas, who talks about the multiplicity of voices, so her academic work around that. And so it's time to end. There's an article that she published in Arts Hub.
Yeah, it's fantastic,
It's
wasn't
a
it?
great article. Tanya
Yeah.
is just a phenomenal academic and a thinker, and she's like grassroots, you know?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
great. So she speaks about how we have to get past the word diversity to just mean, oh, now we've got a black person in here or brown person, whatever. We actually need to have the multiplicity of experiences from that particular group of people. There's more work to be done. Is your workplace safe for that person to walk into every day and to be able to function at their highest level of productivity? Do they feel like they can honestly contribute an opinion? How are you coping, or how are you going to support that person to deal with the lateral violence that often arises because your systems of hiring actually don't acknowledge the historic injustice that means that the person that you're hiring for this diversity box that you're trying to tick is actually coming from a historically excluded population and therefore economically disadvantaged situation. So therefore the person who gets that role then has now a different relationship to everybody else who doesn't have, and they do have. Right?
Yeah.
So not only are they dealing with the white supremacy that is embedded within the institution, but now they're also dealing with the lateral violence within their own communities as well.